The smell hit him firstwards. Not the recycled air of the station, not the chemical bite of the scrubbers. Something else. Something organic and wrong. Sweet, like sweetened protein paste, left in a warm corridor for too long. Kale Morrow pressed his back against the wall of his bunk module and breathed. His mouth. He counted to 4. He told himself it was the filtration unit again. He told himself a lot of things these days. The package was sitting on the floor beneath the ventilation grate when he finally looked. Plain, gray-white. No markings, no manifest seal, no sender glyph. He crouched and studied it for a long time without touching it. His coffee was getting cold on the desk behind him. The package was roughly the size of his fist, wrapped in a material that wasn't quite paper and wasn't quite anything he had a word for. He turned it over with a stylus. It was empty. He could tell from the weight before he even opened it. That particular lightness that felt insulting, somehow. Like a joke with no punchline, he sealed it in a sample bag and flagged it to security. They logged it, nothing else. He changed the grate lock that evening. He wasn't sure that meant anything. Kale was a systems integrity analyst aboard the DSC Harrogate, a mid-class relay station orbiting the 4th moon of HFY, a gas giant that nobody had bothered naming anything better, because nobody had expected humans to still be here 9 years after the Covenant of Separation. The Covenant was what the diplomatic corps called it. Everybody else called it the Retreat. The Quorum had decided, in their collective, unhurried, biologically networked way, that humanity's presence in the outer systems constituted a pattern disruption. The Quorum didn't use the word threat. They used disruption, which Kale privately felt was more frightening, because threats could be negotiated with, and disruptions were simply corrected. The Harrogate was one of 11 relay stations that remained in Quorum-adjacent space by mutual agreement. Or what passed for mutual agreement when one party communicated through chemical signal cascades and the other party used radio. They were a presence, not a garrison. Observers. The treaty was fragile enough that nobody with authority liked to think about it too hard. So they didn't, and Kale spent his days auditing subsystem logs for anomalies and trying not to think about the Quorum relay buoy that hung 40,000 kilometers off the station's bow, blinking its steady amber. The second package appeared 6 days later. It was in the same spot, same material, same insulting lightness. He hadn't changed the grate lock. He'd replaced the entire grate housing with a solid panel, and he'd triple-bolted it from the inside. He sat in the middle of his bunk module for a while, with his hands flat on his knees, looking at the package, running the math on what should and should not have been physically possible, and then he put it in another sample bag and went to find Chief Engineer Raya Sotende. Raya was the kind of person who dealt with impossible things the way other people dealt with misplaced styluses, with a mild, professional annoyance and an immediate desire to catalog the problem properly before getting emotional about it. She was also the only person on the Harrogate who didn't treat Kale's habit of working 18-hour shifts and eating at his console as a personality failing rather than an operational choice. She turned the bagged package over in her hands. She squeezed it. She looked at the ventilation schematic he'd pulled up on her secondary screen. "Your seal is intact," she said. "I know. Physically, nothing came through that grate." "I know that too." She set the package down and looked at him the way she sometimes looked at system anomalies that couldn't immediately attribute to human error. With a kind of flat, careful attention that meant she was taking it seriously. "You logging your sleep hours? I'm logging them. That's not what I asked." He told her it wasn't a hallucination. She didn't say she believed him. She did say she didn't either, which was the most he'd expected. She flagged the sample for materials analysis and told him to get some rest. He went back to his module and lay in the dark and listened to the station breathe. The Harrogate was built like most mid-class relay stations. A long central spine with module clusters branching off at intervals, designed to be expanded incrementally as population and operational need grew. Most of the spine's secondary corridors were monitored by the station's sensor grid, a system that Kale nominally maintained and that he was now discovering had gaps. Not malfunctions, gap-specific, deliberate feeling gaps in coverage, the kind that would take careful work to create. And that showed up in the logs as routine calibration dead zones. if you weren't looking for a pattern across months of data. He found 8 of them. They formed a path from the station's outer cargo manifold to his bunk module. He sat with that information for a full shift before deciding what to do with it, which was mostly because he was afraid of what it implied, and partly because the one person he would normally have brought a finding like this to was Chief of Station Aldrich Moore, and Aldrich Moore made Kale feel the particular unease of a man who suspects he is being laughed at in a language he doesn't speak. Moore was charming in the way that suggested charm was a tool he'd selected for this particular job, the way you'd select the right wrench. He was always pleased to hear from Kale. He was always very interested in Kale's work. He had never, in 3 years, acted on a single concern Kale had brought to him without first smiling at it. The third package arrived the same night Kale found the sensor gaps. He didn't even go to security. He sealed it with the others and sat looking at the 3 of them lined up on his desk and understood the particular clarity of a man who has been fighting a conclusion for too long, that the packages were the point. Whatever they were eventually going to contain. And he was certain now that they were building towards something. These emptinesses were a sequence. They needed him to keep trying to understand them. They needed his attention. He was being watched watching them. He thought about the quorum relay buoy. He thought about the amber blink. He thought about the covenant of separation and the diplomatic language that surrounded it. The careful, clinical way the quorum's registered communicants phrased their transmissions. The use of disruption instead of threat. The use of integration instead of whatever word they used among themselves for the thing they were actually describing. He thought about the way chemical signals could carry information over distances that radio couldn't, through mediums that sensors weren't calibrated to detect, through vents and seals and solid panel housings that had been replaced and triple-bolted inside. He went to find the station's janitor. Tomas Herrera was 63 years old, had been aboard the Harrogate for 11 of them, and was the only person Kale had ever met who seemed genuinely untroubled by the presence of the quorum relay buoy 40,000 kilometers off the. He cleaned the corridors at odd hours and kept a small garden of nitrogen-tolerant herbs in his utility closet, and had an opinion about coffee. That was specific enough to constitute a philosophy. He was also, Kale had noticed over 3 years of late-shift corridor crossings, the only person on the station who never seemed to be carrying anything. Nova slate, no diagnostic tool, no packet of food. Just himself, moving through the station skin like he'd grown there. "You don't get packages," Kale said. It wasn't a question. Mas looked up from the herb tray. He had the kind of face that had decided, somewhere around the age of 40, to stop pretending expressions were necessary for minor social transactions. "No. Why not? Because I don't have anything they want." Kale sat down on the floor of the utility closet, which was something he would not have done 3 weeks ago, and looked at the old man's herb garden. The herbs were doing well. That seemed important, though he couldn't say why. "Who's they?" "Don't know that I'd call them a who," Tomas said. "More of a what." He told Kale the rest of it slowly. "The way you tell someone something you've been carrying alone for a long time, and have given up expecting anyone to believe." He'd been on a station near Veth Corridor when the first quorum integration experiments had been documented. Not by the diplomatic corps, not in any official channel, but by the kind of people who operated relay stations, and who had learned to read the silence between transmissions. The experiments weren't aggressive. The quorum didn't do aggressive. They did patient. They identified humans who exhibited what their communicants described as high integration potential. Individuals with specific neurological patterns, specific social isolation signatures, specific cognitive profiles that suggested they might respond well to what the quorum called bridging, and they delivered a compound in stages. Empty packages first. The compound came later, when the target stress response been proposed sufficiently, when they knew the dosage and the vector, and the precise moment the humans' defenses would be lowest. The compound wasn't a toxin, it wasn't a weapon, it was closer to a question, Tomas said. A very specific question asked directly to the nervous system. Will you integrate? Most people said yes eventually, not because they chose to, because they stopped being the kind of person who could choose otherwise. What does integration mean? Kale asked. Specifically. Tomas looked at him for a long moment. You become a relay. Kale sat with that. Like the buoy, but biological. Quorum's network extends through inorganic relays in space and organic relays in. Tomas paused. In things that used to be people. The herb garden was doing well. Small, green, specific. Resistant to the station's recycled atmosphere by virtue of careful selection and patient tending. Kale thought about that for a while. How do you know all this? He finally asked. Because I was on the list once, Tomas said.
Different profile than...
Too much social contact, they decided. Wrong kind of brain. They moved on. So they moved on to me. 3 packages, Tomas said. Yes, you're past the profiling stage. Kale went back to his module and did not sleep. He opened his system's integrity console and pulled every log he had access to. Sensor data, atmospheric readings, maintenance records, waste processing manifests. He built a map. He was good at building maps of things that weren't supposed to have shapes. It was what he'd spent 9 years doing in a professional capacity, because relay stations were complicated systems with 1,000 interdependencies. And the most dangerous failures were always the ones that looked like nothing was wrong. The map he built over the next 14 hours was not comforting. The Harrogate had 47 residents. 12 of them showed behavioral markers, consistent with what Tomas had described. Specific consumption fixations, reduced social variability, progressive narrowing of preferences, down to single products, single actions, single loops. The station's commissary records showed it clearly when you knew what to look for. A crew member who had 6 months ago cycled through 8 different protein sources now ordered the same algae block every meal. Another, who had maintained correspondence with 19 people off station, now sent 1 transmission to 1 address, containing the same 12 words in varying order. Chief of Station Aldrich Moore had been ordering the same brand of synthetic coffee, a brand that was not in the station's standard supply chain, and that arrived on the quarterly resupply manifest under the line item for specialty consumables for the last 14 months. The order quantity had increased every quarter. Neil thought about the smile Moore used for the conversations, where he'd listened very carefully and did nothing. He thought about the sensor gaps, the deliberate feeling absences in coverage. He thought about who would have the access level to create them. He encrypted his map and his logs under his own personal key, which was not stored anywhere on the Harrogate's central system, because he was a systems integrity analyst, and he had always understood, abstractly, that the most important thing about sensitive data was knowing where it lived. Then he went to find Raya. She was in the engineering bay, running diagnostics on the secondary filtration array. She looked at him when he came in, and then she looked at him again in a different way, put down her diagnostic tool and crossed her arms. You look like you've done something either very smart or very stupid, she said. Both. He handed her a data chip. I need you to hold this, not on the station's network, physically hold it. She took it without asking questions, which was why he'd come to her. What's on it? Evidence. He paused. And a plan, if the evidence turns out to mean what I think it means. She looked at the chip, then at him. Is this about the packages? It's about the packages, and about 15 other things that I should have connected to the packages 3 months ago. Raya put the chip in her breast pocket against the skin. What do you need from me? Access to the outer cargo manifold, and 6 hours where nobody knows where I am. She gave him both, because she trusted him, and because she was Raya, and also because she'd run her own numbers on the behavioral data and come to a conclusion she wanted to voice. She told him this while she was handing him the manifold access codes. The way you admit something when you've run out of reasons not to. I thought I was being paranoid, she said. You weren't. Before he went to the manifold, he went to see the neighbor. That was what everyone on the residential deck called him, simply and without irony. The neighbor. His name was in the station registry as Cesare Vane, a contracted independent data broker who had transferred to the Harrogate 18 months ago on a 6-month renewable and had not renewed so much as introduced himself to anyone on his deck. He was the kind of man who wore presence like a deliberate instrument. He moved through common spaces with a particular unhurried confidence that made other people feel as if they were in his way. Kale had spoken to him exactly once, in the corridor outside the commissary, and Vane had looked at him with a mild, assessing curiosity. The way you'd look at a mechanism you were trying to understand, without letting it know. Kale knocked. Vane opened the door after a long pause, in the specific way of a person who has been awake for some time, but prefers to give the impression of having just woken. He was holding a can of Cola 500. He looked at Kale. He smiled, easy and without warmth. "Systems man," he said. "Can I come in?" Pause this time was shorter, which Kale read as either confidence or curiosity or both. Vane stepped back. Kale came in and looked at the room. The refrigerator was open. Every shelf held cans of Cola 500, stacked with the quiet, obsessive orderliness of a collection rather than a supply. Kale counted 32 visible cans before he stopped counting. There were others, he thought, in the cabinets behind the refrigerator. More than one person could reasonably consume. More than any one person had ordered from the commissary, which meant they were arriving from somewhere else. He knew where.
"You've been getting packages," Kale said.
It wasn't a question. Vane drank from his can. He didn't look at the refrigerator. Everybody gets packages. Everybody except Tomas. And everybody except me. Until 3 weeks ago. Something moved behind Vane's eyes that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite fear. "You've been talking to the old man. He told me what he knew. I want to know what you know." Vane set the can down on the counter with the particular care of a man managing something. He crossed his arms and looked at Kale, and the easy confidence was still there. But it was working harder now. "I know that asking certain questions on this station is a bad idea for your health and your employment continuity. I'm asking anyway. I can see that." Vane looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in the assessment. The quality of the curiosity changed, became something closer to surprise. Not at the question, Kale thought. At the fact that the person asking it didn't look afraid. "Packages started for me 8 months ago. I told security. Security logged it. Nothing. Did you try to find the source? I'm a data broker. Finding sources is what I do." He picked up the can again, then set it down without drinking. He was looking at it without meaning to. "I found the sensor gaps. Followed them to the manifold. Didn't like what I found in the manifold, so I stopped looking. Because you'd already started drinking the Cola 500. Vane looked at the refrigerator. He looked at it the way you look at something you've decided not to look at. And then he turned away, and Kale saw what it cost him. "It started as a preference," he said quietly. Then it wasn't a preference anymore. It was a direction, like being pointed somewhere and not being able to point yourself elsewhere. But you know what it is. Knowing what it is doesn't make you immune to it. That's the thing they counted on, I think. Once you understand it, you're already far enough along that understanding it doesn't help." Kale thought about that. "Do you want me to fix it?" The pause that followed was the longest one yet. Vane looked at his hands. He looked at the refrigerator. He looked at Kale, and whatever was left of Cesare Vane, underneath the thing that was currently directing him toward Cola 500 and service to a Quorum network node, back, tired and angry in the specific way of a man who has been losing a fight he didn't know he'd entered. "Yes," he said. "Then, stay in your module with the ventilation sealed when I tell you to," Kale said. "I'll tell you when." He left Vane, standing in his overstocked refrigerator with his can, and went to find the manifold. The outer cargo manifold was the oldest part of the Harrogate, bolted on during the station's initial construction phase, and never fully modernized, which meant its internal routing was labyrinthine, and its documentation was incomplete, and it was, consequently, the one part of the station that Kale knew better than anyone else, because it was the part that generated the most anomalous logs. He had spent years mapping it. He knew which conduits ran where. He knew which access panels were original and which had been replaced. He knew which sections of the manifold sat outside the sensor grid's coverage, and how to reach them through corridors that appeared on no current schematic. He also knew where the Quorum's delivery mechanism was. He had deduced it from the atmospheric data. Chemical signals required a medium, and in a sealed station the medium was the air. The compound was being introduced through the station's atmosphere at concentrations below the scrubber's detection threshold. Not all at once, but in targeted microdoses, delivered through a secondary injection point that someone had installed in the manifold's intake housing. The installation was elegant. It required detailed knowledge of the station's systems and quiet, sustained access, and it had been there for at least 18 months based on the calibration data. It was also, by Cale's estimate, about 12 hours from its next delivery cycle. He sat in the dark of the manifold for a long time, cross-legged on the cold deck plating, looking at the injector with a hand torch. It was a small thing, smooth and slightly warm to the touch, like it had a metabolism. He thought about the quorum and their patience. He thought about the way they didn't use the word threat. He thought about all the people on this station who were slowly, consensually, from the quorum's point of view, becoming something that had the shape of a person but the function of a node. He thought about Tomas's herb garden, specific, resistant, carefully selected. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who couldn't be integrated. Not because you were special, not because you were chosen, because you were stubborn in the particular way that humans were stubborn, which was not the refusal to bend, but the refusal to stop noticing. You kept logging the anomalies. You kept building the maps. You kept sitting on the floor of the utility closet, asking the questions that the situation didn't want you to ask, because something in you, something old and unreasonable and not especially dignified, couldn't stand an unexplained variable. The quorum had built a system to make humans into relays. They had built it carefully and patiently, and with a great deal of biological sophistication. They had not apparently fully accounted for the subsystem engineer who spent 18-hour shifts auditing logs for anomalies, because the job needed doing and nobody else doing it properly. Cale pulled the injector. It came free with a sound like a small seal breaking, which was exactly what it was. He held it in his palm and looked at it and felt, not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and more durable. The particular satisfaction of a problem that has been correctly diagnosed and correctly addressed. He had spent his entire career knowing that the most dangerous failures were the ones that looked like nothing was wrong, and he had been right about that. And now the failure was in his hand, and it was not large. He took it apart with his multi-tool. He understood its mechanism inside of 20 minutes. Because he was good at understanding mechanisms, and because the quorum, for all their biological sophistication, had built a device that was ultimately a delivery system. And delivery systems had physics, and physics didn't care who had invented it. He identified the chemical payload chamber. He identified the dispersal timing circuit. He identified the reservoir that connected it to the manifold's atmospheric intake. Then he made some modifications. He worked for 4 hours in the dark of the manifold, using his torch and his tools, and the knowledge he'd accumulated over 9 years of caring, very specifically about the infrastructure of places like this. He was not a chemist, and he was not a biologist, but he was a systems engineer, and a system was a system. You didn't need to understand every component to understand the function. You needed to understand the relationship between components. You needed to know what happened when you changed a variable. Point around the second, sitting hour, sitting cross-legged on the cold deck, plating with his multi-tool in one hand, and the injector's dispersal circuit in the other, he became aware that he was humming. He didn't know when he'd started. Tune was something his mother had put on in the kitchen when he was a kid. Something old and unhurried, a song about a river or a road or maybe just about moving without knowing where you were going. He'd never looked up the title. He didn't stop humming. He kept working. He thought about the quorum's patience while he worked. It was genuinely impressive. As a quality, the kind of patience that only became possible when you didn't experience time the way something with a single nervous system did. The quorum was a network, distributed across thousands of nodes, and however many organic relays they'd accumulated across however many years in however many systems. They thought in cascades. They planned in generations. The idea that a single human in a single maintenance shift, working by torchlight in a corridor that wasn't on any current schematic, might constitute a meaningful variable in their calculations. That idea would have struck them, Cale thought, as the kind of disruption too small to model, which was, of course, exactly the size he was. He changed several variables. When he was done, the injector was back in its housing. The manifold looked exactly as it had. The sensor logs, if anyone checked them, would show nothing. He went back to his module and showered and ate a meal he didn't taste. And then he went to Raya's station and sat across from her and told her what he'd done. He listened without interrupting, which was a thing she could do that he had always admired. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You reversed the compound. Roughly. What does roughly mean? It means I don't have a chemistry background, and I worked with what the mechanism gave me. The payload I configured will disperse through the atmosphere, same as the original. But instead of the integration compound, it'll introduce a peptide inhibitor that will bind to the quorum's chemical markers and flag them for the immune system. Anyone who's received a partial dose will begin clearing it within 72 hours. He paused. The ones further along will take longer. More.
Or will take longer.
Rhea looked at the data chip in her breast pocket, which she had not yet inserted into anything. And the quorum knows you've done this. They will when the delivery cycle runs and the network response doesn't match what they're expecting. What happens then? He had thought about this. He had thought about it for most of the 4 hours he'd spent in the manifold dark, in the intervals between making modifications and checking connections and recalculating dispersal rates. The quorum was patient. They were also not incapable of urgency when their network's integrity was at stake. A relay station that was actively clearing its integration compounds was a disruption. The quorum dealt with disruptions by correcting them. They'll send something, Kale said. Probably not a ship. More likely an escalated chemical signal, something that pushes the integration process faster. Try to lock down whatever nodes they have before the inhibitor clears the system. He looked at his hands. We need to transmit before that happens. The full package, sensor gap data, behavioral logs, manifold documentation, the injector's composition, what I've done to it. Everything. Tight beam to the diplomatic liaison at HFY station. That's 4 light hours away. 8 hours round trip for any quorum response to reach us. We have a window. Rhea picked up her diagnostic tool and set it down again. She made the small motion with her jaw that meant she was thinking about something she didn't want to say out loud. The covenant of separation, she said finally. I know. If we transmit evidence that the quorum has been conducting integration experiments on a human relay station, covenant, I know what it does to the covenant. She looked at him. The covenant is already broken, he said. We just haven't been told yet. She was quiet for a long moment. In the corridor outside the engineering bay, the ventilation system ran its cycle, and the station breathed. And somewhere in the manifold, the modified injector sat in its housing, waiting for its scheduled cycle. Going to want to see your dispersal calculations, Rhea said. They're on the chip. She took the chip out of her breast pocket and held it for a moment. And then she inserted it into her personal console, not the station's network. Personal console, which had its own isolated processing core that she maintained herself because she was a chief engineer, and she trusted her own hardware, and she read through the documentation and the logs and the map and the calculations. She read for a long time. Kale drank cold coffee and waited. Your math is right, she said eventually. I know. That's not me agreeing with your plan. That's me telling you your math is right. I'll take it. She almost smiled. Almost. The tight beam is mine to authorize. You know that. I know. And if the quorum responds before the window closes, we document that too. She closed the chip drive. She pulled up the tight beam interface. She began composing the transmission header with the methodical efficiency of someone who had decided that the decision was made and further delay served nothing. Kale watched her and felt the strange, displaced calm of a man who has done the thing he could do and is now waiting to find out what cost. The transmission went out at 4:17 station time. The quorum's response came at 7:52. It was not a ship. It was a signal, precisely as Kale had predicted. An escalated cascade. A chemical frequency surge pushed through the station's atmospheric system through vectors he hadn't neutralized, through channels he hadn't found. Because the quorum had more patience than he had time, and they had been building contingencies into this system for longer than he'd known to look. He felt it in the ventilation. He felt it in the slight sweetness that returned to the air in his module when the signal peaked. He sat in the middle of his bunk room and felt the thing trying to happen to him and thought, not yet, it won't be that simple. Not yet. He had known the inhibitor compound he'd configured wouldn't cover every vector. He had known that. He had calculated the window, the gap, the exposure he would accept. He had made the decision in the manifold in the dark, with his hands smelling of chemical residue and machine oil, and he had decided it was worth it. And he still decided it was worth it, sitting in his module, with his hands flat on his knees, and the sweetness in the air. And whatever the quorum was asking his nervous system, trying to find purchase in a brain that was currently very busy thinking about something else. His comm unit chimed. It was Tomas. Bay 7, the old man said, no preamble. Now. Kale moved through corridors that felt slightly wrong in a way he was too experienced to dismiss. The lighting was the same. The deck plating was the same. The wrongness was in him, or in the air, or in both. The slight perceptual shift that comes from a nervous system being asked to tune to a different frequency. He kept his hand on the wall. He kept naming things. Corridor junction G17, ladder access to bay level, bay 7 hatch, standard manual override, counterclockwise. Tomas was inside with a rebreather unit, the kind used for maintenance work in low oxygen spaces. He handed one to Kale without speaking. Kale put it on, and the sweetness disappeared immediately, and he took a long breath, and felt his thoughts sharpen back into themselves, like a lens. Finding focus. Raya was there too. She was wearing her own unit, and she had a secondary console running on a portable rig, and she was watching a data stream. The inhibitor is working, she said. 12 of them are clearing. More is. She checked. More is fighting it. The signal's still peaking, Kale said through the rebreather. His voice was flat and mechanical and exactly right. I know. I've isolated Bay 7 from the main atmospheric circuit. She glanced at him. Best I could do without alerting whoever is monitoring the system management console. Kale looked at Tomas. The old man was crouched against the bay wall with his rebreather, calm as he was always calm, with the patience of someone who has spent a long time being the only person in a room who understood the dimensions of the problem. When they don't get the integration response they're expecting, Kale said, they'll increase the signal again. Yes, Tomas said, and the rebreathers buy us time but not an answer. No, Kale sat down on the bay floor, back against the wall. He thought about the 4 hours in the manifold. He thought about variables. He thought about what a system does when you change a variable it wasn't expecting you to change. The relay buoy, he said. Raya looked up. Quorum's signal is routed through the relay buoy. That's the transceiver. That's how they're pushing the chemical cascade. He worked through it. The Quorum's biological network operated on chemical frequency principles. But chemical signals in space needed a transceiver, a mechanism to translate throttle frequencies into something that could cross 40,000 kilometers of vacuum. Relay buoy wasn't just a communication marker. It was a broadcast station. If the buoy goes offline, the signal drops, Raya said. And they're back to standard chemical dispersal ranges, which are considerably shorter than 40,000 kilometers. She was already at her console. The buoy is outside our direct control. It's Quorum infrastructure under the Covenant. The Covenant, Kale said, is already broken. She looked at him. He looked back. She turned to her console. The Harrogate had no weapons. It was a relay station, not a garrison. And the Covenant prohibited active armaments within the Quorum adjacent zone. It had, however, a suite of survey instruments that included a high-powered electromagnetic pulse emitter used for subsurface geological mapping of HFY's moons. The emitter had a range at full power of approximately 52,000 kilometers. The relay buoy was at 40,000. The emissions permit for the geological survey instrument required a countersignature from the chief of station. Aldrich Moore was in his quarters. His door was locked from the inside, and he had not responded to 3 comm attempts, and the behavioral data on Raya's screen showed his integration levels falling and spiking and falling as the inhibitor worked against the Quorum's escalated signal. He was not at this moment capable of countersigning anything. The Harrogate's emergency operations protocol, however, provided that in the absence of a responsive chief of station, a countersigned authorization from the chief engineer and a senior department head constituted valid operational approval for any instrument with a dual-key requirement. Kale was a senior department head. Rhea was the chief engineer. They looked at each other for a moment through their rebreathers, and then Rhea pulled up the authorization form, and Kale signed it, and then she signed it, and then she ran the emitter diagnostic and confirmed targeting, and said, in a very flat and professional voice, firing in 30 seconds. You should know this will be flagged as a treaty violation. Flag it, Kale said. Make sure it's in the same transmission log as the integration evidence. She fired at 30 seconds exactly. The relay buoy's amber blink, which had been visible through the observation ports for 9 years in which Kale had learned to ignore the way you learned. To ignore a sound that, always there, went dark. The sweetness in the air of the station peaked. One final surge, Quorum's signal hitting maximum intensity at the moment its transceiver went offline, like a scream cut off mid-breath, and then it began to fade. Kale sat on the floor of Bay 7 with his rebreather on and his back against the wall. Listened to the station breathe. After a while he took the rebreather off. The air was clean, or it was clean enough, he thought briefly, about what the Quorum had been experiencing at that moment. If experiencing was the right word for something that thought in chemical cascades, across a distributed biological network. The emitter firing would have registered as a sudden, absolute silence, a signal that had been running continuously for years. He wondered if they felt it. He wondered if silence, for a network intelligence that had never experienced interruption, was a sound. He hoped it was loud. Aya pulled up the atmospheric readouts on her portable console. Inhibitor dispersal is proceeding. 12 clearing now. 2 showing slower response, probably higher cumulative dose. She scrolled down. Moore's integration levels are dropping but erratically. He's fighting it. Or it's fighting him. Same thing from the outside. She was right. Kale had looked at the behavioral data on Moore long enough to understand that the man who had smiled his way through 3 years of Kale's concerns was not a straightforwardly compromised agent. He was a man who had been changed by degrees, in amounts small enough to be deniable, in ways that felt, from the inside, like preference rather than direction. He had not, Kale thought, known what was happening to him. That was the cruelest part of the Quorum's methodology. It didn't feel like invasion. It felt like self. By the time the self was mostly theirs, part that remained wasn't capable of recognizing the substitution. The part that remained was fighting now, in the chemical dark of Moore's neurology, which was both more and less than Kale had hoped to give him back. Vane, Kale said. Check his readings. Rhea entered the ID. Kale watched her face. She was not a person who showed relief carelessly. Something in her expression settled. A small thing, a single degree of tension releasing from around her eyes. He's clearing. Faster than expected. His integration wasn't as deep. She looked at Kale. You spoke to him before the manifold. Yes. That's not in your documentation yet. It will be. She shook her head. It was as close as Rhea ever got to admiration in a professional context. She went back to her readouts. Kale stayed on the floor of Bay 7, back against the wall, and watched the numbers change. Tomas was still there too, crouched near the bay's interior hatch, patient and unsurprised as he had been through all of it. At some point he produced a thermos from somewhere inside his coverall and poured 2 cups, and set Kale without a word. And Kale drank it, and it was coffee, and it was good, which seemed to him at that particular moment, treat, like sufficient proof that certain things were worth the trouble of preserving. The inhibitor was doing its work and the signal was fading. And the 12 people who had been slowly becoming relays were slowly becoming themselves. Again, and Aldrich Moore was on the floor of his quarters fighting his way back to a consciousness that was entirely his own. Kale suspected would be disorienting and painful, and ultimately, a mercy. The diplomatic liaison will have our transmission by now, Rhea said. Yes. And whatever comes next will come next. He looked at his hands. We documented everything. She made a small sound that might have been agreement. Moore's going to have questions. He's going to have answers. The documentation covers him too. Kale paused. It covers everyone. Tomas was still crouched against the wall, calm, with his rebreather pushed up to his forehead. He was looking at Kale in the way he sometimes looked at the herb garden, with a quiet attention that, Wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite its opposite. Just a specific kind of seeing. You know what the quorum's communicants will say, he said, when this goes to the treaty review. That it was an integration protocol, that we disrupted it. Yes. Then we'll need to explain the difference, Kale said, between disruption and refusal, since they seem to be having trouble with the concept. Tomas smiled, which was a rare enough event that Raya noticed and looked up. The old man had a good smile, unhurried, rooted in something that had been tested and held. Get some sleep, he said to Kale. You look like a man who's been solving the wrong problem for 3 weeks and just noticed. I have been, yes, but you stopped. Kale went back to his module. He didn't go immediately. He went first to the mana fold, back through the corridors that felt like themselves again, and he opened the housing and looked at the modified injector and confirmed that it had run its cycle. The reservoir was empty. The inhibitor compound had dispersed. The work was done. He sealed the housing and logged the access and added the log to the documentation package. That was already, by now, sitting in the diplomatic liaison's queue at HFY Station, along with everything else. The sensor gaps, behavioral maps, the manifold schematics, the injector's composition, the escalated signal data, the emitter authorization, countersigned emergency protocol. A complete record. The kind of record that was very hard to dismiss as paranoia or malfunction or the isolated behavior of an antisocial subsystem engineer who spent too much time alone with his logs. He went back to his module and sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at the ventilation grate, which was the solid panel he'd bolted in place 3 weeks ago, which he had not removed because he hadn't needed to and because the principle held. You blocked the vectors you knew about. You modified the ones you found. You documented everything and you transmitted it and you trusted. With the unreasonable stubbornness of a species that had spent its entire history doing this exact thing in one form or another, that the record would outlast the attempt to erase it. No package came. The space below the grate was empty and would stay empty, and Kale looked at that emptiness. And it felt, for the first time in weeks, like the right kind. He lay down on his bunk. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Tomas's herbs growing in recycled air in a utility closet on a relay station, at the edge of an agreement that no longer meant what it had been signed to mean: small, specific, resistant. He thought about the amber blink that was no longer blinking. He closed his eyes. He slept. The response from the diplomatic liaison arrived 14 hours later, while Kale was on his second cup of coffee and his third read-through of the behavioral data. Not because he needed to read it again, but because he was the kind of person who checked his work, and also because there was still the question of how many of the station's residents had received doses too early in the integration process to respond fully to the inhibitor, and that question required a careful answer rather than an optimistic one. The liaison's transmission was short. It acknowledged receipt. It confirmed that the evidence package was being reviewed by the Treaty Commission. It noted that an independent verification team would be dispatched within the week. It contained, at the end, a single sentence that was not diplomatic language, and not treaty language, and not the careful, calibrated phrasing of anyone who dealt professionally. The quorum, it said. We had 5 other stations reporting anomalies. We didn't know what to look for. We do now. Kale read that sentence several times. He thought about 5 other stations. He thought about the people on them who had been ordering the same thing at every meal, sending the same words to the same address, becoming slowly and consensually. From the quorum's point of view, something that had the shape of themselves but the function of something else. He opened a new log file. He began documenting a methodology. Not a report, a methodology. The kind of thing a person wrote when they wanted to make sure that the next person who encountered this problem would not spend 3 weeks fighting a conclusion before arriving at it. He wrote about the atmospheric data and what to look for in the commissary records and how the sensor gaps presented in the maintenance logs and what questions to ask if you started receiving packages. He wrote about the rebreather and the inhibitor and the dispersal calculations and the emitter authorization and the emergency operations protocol. He wrote about the commissary data, the specific signatures of integration, the narrowing of consumption patterns, the progressive social withdrawal, The way behavioral variability collapsed around a single product or a single action loop, with the quiet inevitability of a drain pulling water. He wrote about more, and the sensor gaps, and the counter-signature protocol, and the importance of knowing where your data was stored and who had access. What? He wrote about Vane, and the value of talking to someone who was already partially integrated, because the partially integrated still had a self capable of wanting to be recovered, and that want was actionable. He wrote about Tomas. He wrote that the most important person in any system under quiet threat was the one who had not been targeted, because they were special or protected or immune, but because they were the only one who could see clearly, and seeing clearly was worth more than any other variable in the problem. You needed to find that person and you needed to listen to them, even when what they told you was difficult, because the quorum's methodology depended on the targeted person's isolation, and isolation could be broken by two people sitting on the floor of a utility closet, talking about something real. He wrote carefully and specifically, and without flourish, the way he wrote all his documentation, because documentation was not for the person writing it. Documentation was for the person who came after. He thought about that for a while. He thought about the quorum, and their patience, and their biological networks, and their careful, unhurried understanding that time was on their side, that any species with a long enough horizon could afford to wait out the interruptions caused by smaller, shorter, noisier species with bad sleep schedules and a compulsive need to log everything. He thought they might have miscalculated that last part. The quorum was old and patient and distributed across more nodes than Kale could count, and they would not abandon a methodology because of one relay station and one emitter pulse and one transmission to one diplomatic liaison. They would adapt. They would find new vectors and new timing and new targets. They had generations. They had a network. They had biological machinery that operated below any sensor threshold humanity had so far thought to calibrate for, and they had a working hypothesis that humanity's tendency toward social isolation, its compartmentalization, its institutional silos, its careful professional boundaries, made individual humans easy to work on quietly. What they hadn't fully accounted for, he thought, was what happened when the compartmentalization broke down. When the systems analyst knocked on the janitor's door at an odd hour and asked an comfortable question and actually listened to the answer. When the chief engineer inserted a chip into her personal console rather than the station network because she trusted her own hardware. When the data broker opened his door to the systems analyst and said, "Yes, fix it," even though the part of him being directed by the quorum's integration compound was screaming against it. When the people who were supposed to stay in their professional lanes simply didn't, because someone had shown them the gap in the floor, and they looked into it, and found, looking back, something that made them decide the lanes could wait. The quorum thought in networks, so, it turned out, did humans. They just built theirs differently, messily, out of trust and shared coffee and late shifts and stubborn unwillingness to ignore an anomaly in the log. It wasn't elegant, it was rarely efficient. It didn't have the biological grace of a species that had been networked for millennia. It was enough. He saved the file. He added it to the transmission queue for the diplomatic liaison. He flagged it for distribution to the other 11 relay stations in the adjacent zone. He thought about the people on those stations who were maybe receiving empty packages and going to security and getting their report logged and nothing else. Them sitting alone in their modules running the math on things that shouldn't be possible, fighting the conclusion, not sure who to trust. He added a note at the top of the methodology document. It said, "You are not imagining it. Find the person who hasn't been targeted. Start there." Then he picked up his coffee and walked down to Tomas's utility closet and knocked on the door and asked if the old man wanted company, because the herbs were doing well. And it seemed like a reasonable morning to sit somewhere that was growing. Something. Tomas opened the door and looked at him, and stepped back to let him in, and that was enough. They sat for a while in the small, warm space among the nitrogen-tolerant herbs, drinking coffee, not saying much. The herbs were a particular green that Kale associated with nothing on the station. It was the green of something that had decided, in defiance of recycled air and artificial lighting, and the ambient existential pressure of being 40 kilometers from a now-dark relay, to grow anyway. He found it unreasonably comforting. "You're going to have to brief the verification team," Tomas said eventually. "I know. They'll want to know why a systems integrity analyst was the one who found it. I'll tell them I was doing my job." Tomas drank his coffee. That goes looked at the enough. Kale looked at the herbs. "The rest is in the documentation outside. Through the hull of the Harrogate. Through 40,000 kilometers of dark and vacuum. The space where the relay buoy had blinked its amber. For 9 years held nothing, now, but the ordinary light of stars going about their own patient business, indifferent to the small, stubborn, documentation-obsessed species that had spent the morning deciding, again, that it was not yet ready to be anything other than itself. It was not a treaty, it was not a ceasefire, it was not the end of anything. It was a morning, and there was coffee, and the herbs were growing, and the record existed. For now, Kale thought, that was enough. For now, it was more than enough.